With geopolitical analyst Richard Heydarian. He joins us on the show to weigh in from across the world. Magandang umaga, magandang ano ba dyan? Umaga na rin. Okay, una-una, no, I guess, what are your thoughts on the response of Representative Sandro Marcos? Hindi ito asal ng tunay na kapatid. Wow.
At medyo medyo bumaba daw. Ang baba daw ng mga ginagawa ni. No, I mean it's what almost 11 p.m. here. Matutulog na sana ako after a very long day, and the next thing I know, ito na parang bardagulan na nangyari. We saw no less than the majority leaders sa ating Kongreso, si Congressman Sandro, coming out with really tough statements. I think usually we used to wait for the First Lady to say something about this Marcos-Duterte feud before something dramatic happens. Remember, last year nung sinabi ni First Lady na patshot na siya sa ating Vice Presidente because of her supposed misreaction to the Duterte family making fun of her husband and the Commander-in-Chief. Now it looks like Sandro is taking up the cudgels for his family in many ways by making clear na they have been tolerating the Senator Imee Marcos, who has been, really criticizing and throwing shades at the president for quite some time. But I think what we saw yesterday is going for the jugular na si Senator Imee Marcos. It's not clear what her intention here is. Is she trying to burn the bridges, but at the same time build a bridge with a potential new constituency, which is the basically Duterte camp? There's some pre-election surveys, I know it's quite early, but some pre-election surveys suggested that actually an Imee Marcos and a Sara Duterte team up could be very strong, basically bringing solid North and solid South together. But with the response from Majority Leader Sandro, I think it's very clear that the Marcos family will not be unified if ever Imee Marcos decides to run for a higher office. And let's not forget, she barely got into the Senate. She really got in by the skin of her teeth, and I look at the numbers. I'm from the I'm Ilocano again. I mean, this might get misquoted. From my understanding of things on the ground, Imee Marcos did benefit from the support of basically the loyalist Ilocano pro Marcos constituencies. So now I'm not sure what Senator Imee Marcos is really up to, because his response by Congressman Sanders shows that the first family has had enough of this. So it's quite possible that certain bridges have been burned, and that from now on perhaps the tolerance will not be there, and the battle lines have been drawn. Whether this is going to be effective for Imee Marcos or whether it is going to be destabilizing for the administration, I think we can argue about that. But the least I can say, as someone who's trying desperately to get back to the Philippines with not so expensive tickets, is that I'm not sure Imee Marcos is helping her career here. I'm not sure she's helping her constituency back in the Ilocos region where the Marcoses are strong. But I think she's not helping the country. I think these kinds of attacks on the Commander-in-Chief, questioning him based on very questionable claims, this is just going to feed into the climate of uncertainty, which is already affecting our economy very bad.
But she made serious allegations also there, claiming that her brother's decision-making has been influenced by the use of illegal drugs, not just the president, also the First Lady, also the presidential son. Do you think that matters? Why this specific revelation dropped by the sister? Ang dami naman din pwede, di ba? Pero itong mismong paggamit ng illegal na droga, was this meant to fan the flames of the public's anger, to hopefully turn this 3-day protest into something more? Anong basa mo?
Well, again, obvious na maraming frustration dyan. No? So, sa pagkaalam ko, hindi sang-ayon ng mga iba't ibang grupo on the way forward. Mukhang yung pro-Duterte camp, and some would argue Imee Marcos is already firmly in that camp. Baka ang gusto nila, actually hindi siya baka, I think it's quite clear, ang gusto nila dito is mag-resign ng presidente, so basically change in government if not change in the regime. Pero sa pagkaalam natin, that 3-day rally by the INC, it looks like the INC leadership is very clear that they're not calling for a change in the administration. What they're calling for is for some significant reforms to address concerns with accountability and corruption. And that's why the timing of this latest cabinet reshuffle, I think, is perhaps not a coincidence. We knew that Executive Secretary Bersamin, ex-Executive Secretary Bersamin, was potentially part of a reshuffle for quite some time, but to have even the budget secretary part of this, and to have it exactly a day after the massive show of force by the best organized religious organization in the country, arguably, right, outside the Catholic Church. I think the timing tells that perhaps maybe the president and the INC leadership, perhaps they have an understanding on the way forward, and that the INC is not interested in pushing for political destabilization or pushing for the change to administration, which leaves the pro-Duterte camp, which arguably includes the Imee Marcos, in a bind. So I think you were absolutely right by suggesting that perhaps this is an act of desperation, because she's really burning bridges with the ruling faction within the Marcos dynasty, if I can put it that way. And I'm not sure how is this going to help her political career in the coming years. President Marcos could become a lame duck president in a year or two, or maybe earlier, but he's still the commander-in-chief. And still a significant chunk of the country, including the Iglesia Ni Cristo leadership, are not calling for the resignation of the president, but rather want a constructive way whereby there's significant reform on the corruption and accountability issues.
Tingin mo ba tanggap na ng Duterte side or faction si Senator Imee Marcos? I mean, dati na pag-uusapan lang natin dito na namamangka siya sa dalawang ilog. Now she's clearly defining her political lines, aligning herself with the Duterte camp. Possibly, I mean, it could help her survive, right? Through the next administration. Has she been already accepted by the Duterte side for her?
I mean, nakita naman natin na maraming nag-react, no? Nung in-endorse ni Vice President Sara Duterte sa Imee Marcos nung election time. You could argue that perhaps that was decisive, or perhaps help Imee Marcos to get across the line, to win by the skin of her teeth. But nevertheless, I'm sure that there are also people in the Duterte camp, maybe supportive of a Sara for 2028, but not necessarily supportive of a Duterte running with another Marcos. At least what's clear is that para kay Imee Marcos, perhaps she wants to win over that pro-Duterte camp, and basically saying that I'm not BBM. And BBM, basically ang sinasabi na dito is BBM is not representative of the Marcos brand. And so even though Marcos siya, she could be a viable, and she could be an effective and loyal and reliable partner for Sara Duterte if ever they run. As I said, some pre-election surveys said that an Imee-Sara matchup could be theoretically very, very strong, right? So I think definitely there's that kind of messaging. So this messaging could alienate some in the loyalist space. Clearly it's not winning over the non-partisan Filipinos. But I think this is an conscious attempt by her to win over folks in the pro-Duterte camp who are not convinced that they should support yet another Marcos come 2028.
But do you think she's somehow convinced the Dutertes by going against her own family? I mean, she spoke of very personal experiences inside, no? Essentially going against most of her own. How do you think this comes across to Filipinos mostly? To whose favor do you think this revelation will work?
Well, sensitive issue ang family issue, no? Kaya actually, generally, I've been trying not to talk too much about this whole sibling rivalry issue, which is, I think everyone has known about this as far as, all you have to do is just read about the history of the Marcoses. It's a very sensitive issue. It's a sensitive issue for the family, sensitive issues for Ilocanos to support the Marcoses. Of course, they don't want to split in the family. But let's be honest, I think Senator Imee Marcos' intervention, very feisty intervention, and the response we saw from Majority Leader Sandro Marcos says that indeed perhaps we're moving towards that perhaps official splitting na within the House of Marcos, and clearly that will send reverberations across our political system and complicate further alignments and realignments ahead of 2020 elections. As I said, this is a big gamble by Imee. Perhaps this move will endear her to majority of the DDS or pro-Duterte supporters, but it could come at the expense of significant number of people from so-called solid North or from supporters of the House of Marcos who could see this as a form of betrayal. So it's a very, very risky move from her, and the fact that she barely got into the Senate in the last election shows that perhaps her margin of error is not that big, or at the very least, this is a very, very big gamble on her part.
Okay, right after that speech by Senator Imee Marcos, the INC cut short na its supposedly 3-day protest. What do you think happened there? Do you echo Ronald's observation na nagbago ng posisyon itong INC starting on the first day? Probably baka meron na negotiation somewhere there, quid pro quo. Did you notice the same thing? And where do you think does the INC stand on this? Because right after that speech, she was shown being congratulated by the Iglesia, including Senator Rodante Marcoleta. So parang anong basa mo dito sa INC as a body and their role in supposed or an emerging or a possible withdrawal of support by the military, rumored?
Gretchen, I'm all the way here in University of Oxford, so I'm doing research and econ and maths and all of that. Pero base sa pagkalam natin, I think Secretary Ronald Llamas has been open about it, I think we're sure that there are communication channels. Clearly, the Malacanang and the INC leadership have healthy and robust communication channels. And sa pagkabasa natin dun sa statements ng leadership of the INC, it seems that at least so far, they're not for resignation or change of government, and they're willing to give the president more time and more space to do what is right, what is necessary, and to reassure them pagdating sa mga kanilang demands on issues of corruption and accountability. So I think that creates some breathing room, some cushion, and definitely that takes away the wind from the pro-Duterte camp, who were hoping to have some sort of a denouement or a decisive moment in November. So perhaps the president has bought himself at least a month or two, or if not more. But again, this is going to be a very, very fragile situation, and much will depend not only on communication channels between the Malacanang and the leadership of one of the most organized, best organized religious groups in the country, but much will also depend on yung public perceptions, anong gagawin ng ICI, and ano ba, siguro may mga cabinet reshuffles na parating, diba? Or new appointments or reappointments which could reassure the INC. I think what is absolutely clear at this point is that the INC is a very well-organized religious organization. And kitang-kita natin, they were able to mobilize more than 500,000 people. And I think that's a huge thing. And that's a show of force. And I think INC definitely is a major, major factor in Philippine society.
Okay, maraming salamat. Ginulo ka namin dyan, no? Dahil sa mga pangyayari
Pagtulog
kagabi.
na
Certainly
may
need to hear your voice
so
all the
much.
way there from the University of Oxford. Maraming salamat. We'll get the side of somebody from the other side of the political spectrum. Malutikiya, pero hindi ko kayo pinagsabay para walang bardagulan na mangyayari.
Ang balance, I'm in the middle.
Thank you for joining us here on Morning Matters today, Richard Heydarian.